It's always difficult to sort of take yourself so seriously that you actually have to narrate your own biography. But at the same time, it's very clear that it's impossible to separate the personal and the political. But what often becomes interesting for me is that the personal becomes interesting not so as to collapse the political into it, but in fact to use the personal to illuminate the political. I mean that when your life is able to speak to larger issues, I think then your life might becomes interesting, and at least to others, hopefully. I mean, for me, I was a working class kid. I grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, and I grew up in a very tough neighborhood, actually. My early experiences are really marked by a kind of enormous division, and that is that I learned very quickly that your sense of agency was largely dependent upon physical matters, that you had to be able to defend yourself, you had to be able to talk fast, you had to be able to negotiate terrains in ways in which the knowledge that I got from school was never very helpful. So I immediately began to recognize that there was a relationship, although I couldn't theorize this at the time, between questions of context, the definition of oneself, the question of survival, and how one negotiated the world. And for me, it was a very interesting world because I grew up in a neighborhood that was consisted of lots of Irish, lots of Italians, and on the periphery, black neighborhoods. And the question of survival was always deeply embedded in our everyday lives. And we had to find ways to get money because we all were poor, actually terribly poor. My family was so poor, actually, that I can remember being terribly excited on Thursdays because they went to the market on Thursdays. They bought food on Thursdays. And we would usually run out of food on Tuesdays. So we had very little food to eat until Thursday. And when Thursday came, that was a big day because there were always cookies. There was something that we couldn't ordinarily have. So there was a sense, but there was also a sense in the midst of that poverty of modes of solidarity that mocked me forever. If somebody got sick, the entire neighborhood would come out and help people out. They would cook, they would provide food, they would, if somebody went to the hospital, you knew people. I mean, there was a sense in amidst the struggle of not just danger, but also a certain sense of solidarity, a certain sense of what it meant to become part of a collective. I never saw myself in the earlier parts of my life, and clearly this has had a profound effect on my life. I never saw myself as an isolated individual living, for instance, in a suburban space in which my connections to other people were relatively minor and incidental. Actually, I could not identify myself in the early parts of my life in that neighborhood outside of the context of the social, because the social both established constraints, offered contradictions, and spoke to possibilities that were so rigidly embedded in the contours of everyday life that it was impossible. You never went to school alone. You walked in groups, right? You didn't hang on a corner alone. You didn't engage in recreational facilities alone. There weren't tutors to come in to help you learn how to eventually take the GED, or whatever, the test that you needed to go to college. I mean, none of this happened. So you had to rely on each other, and that had a profound effect on me. What also had a profound effect on me was the fact that in the midst of learning how to survive, you also develop a certain sense of self-reliance. I mean, what it means to be in opposition to forces that clearly place constraints on you that ordinarily most people don't see. So the early part of my life was not frictionless, that's for sure. And when I went to high school, fortunately, I was a basketball player who received a scholarship. But because I never took the SATs, because I wasn't aware that I had to, I couldn't go to college. So I went to a junior college, and I dropped out. of that, and then I worked for a couple of years in a bank and a variety of other jobs, and all of a sudden it dawned on me I had to go back. That there was no way I could endure counting money, and working under those circumstances. And so I did. So I went back. I got another scholarship. I went back. I went to a place now called the University of Southern Maine, graduated, got a scholarship to a place called Appalachian State University, which was in Boone, North Carolina. And at that time, during that period, my political consciousness was really beginning to emerge, because it was also, this is the 1960s. It was impossible in the 1960s not to be aware of what was going on in the outside world. The notion of the utterly privatized, narcissized, isolated, removed from politics individual was very difficult to grasp at a time when there was major protest over the Vietnam War. I had joined SDS at that time when I was in Maine. I'm sorry, first in Maine and then in North Carolina. And then I became a high school teacher. I graduated, became a high school teacher for about 7 years. And then one day I attended a seminar in which Ted Fenton, who happened to be at the time a very famous theorist in what they call social studies, gave a talk, and I asked 3 or 4 questions. He rushed down at the end and he said, you should get a doctorate. I said, really? He said, absolutely. He said, you should come to Carnegie Mellon, we'll pay your way. And I thought, wow, that's unreal. I mean, how would I do that? I told my mother, and my mother wanted to know if I'd be able to write prescriptions. I remember that was always a very moving moment for me. She had no idea. And so I went, and I was lucky, because I worked with a number of people who were very smart. Tony Penna was my advisor. Ted Fenton taught me how to write. I became increasingly more political as time went on. And from there, I came out. I finished very quickly, wrote my dissertation, and I had 2 job offers. I had a job offer up in New York. I forget the name of the school. It was a Catholic school. And I remember how I secured the job. I had the interview on the day of my birthday. And she said, how old are you, the nun? And I said, I'm 33. And she said, it's a good age to be crucified. And I said, no, it's a good age to be resurrected. And it must have been the first time she laughed in her life. And she gave me offered me the job. But then I was also offered a job at Boston University. And there was no comparison, of course. So I went to Boston University. And as soon as I got there, the first day I was walking to school, I walked in what was called the Martin Luther King Center. And Howard Zinn was standing on a box giving a speech. And I thought, I have arrived in heaven. This can't be true. So I wrote him a note, and Howard was one of the most gracious, beautiful, mentoring, lovely men I have ever met. And he kind of took me under his wing. And we used to quarrel over movies. We had a terrible split over Last Tango in Paris. He thought it was reactionary. I thought there was something beneath the politics, the overt politics, that was enormously sensual, and but that was okay. At that time at BU, BU became very important for me, because at that time, education had found a Marxist discourse, as we all know. It was emerging in Canada, it was emerging at OISE, it was emerging in the United States, in a variety of places. It was emerging in Australia. There were many places. It was emerging in England with the new sociology of education. And it was really a dynamic time. People were really beginning to re-theorize what it meant to connect schooling to politics. Bose and Gintis had just written Schooling in Capitalist America, an enormously important book for many of us. Paulo Freire, of course, his work we had already known. Pedagogy of the Oppressed was an enormously important book, because it linked education to social change, whereas Gintis linked education to questions of capitalism, and exactly what that relationship did and what it meant, and the metaphor of schools as factories and schools as modes of social and cultural reproduction began to emerge and became dominant in the language. I was never comfortable with this language. I always felt that in some way it belied what I had seen in the neighborhoods in which I had grown up. I had never viewed workers as simply duped. I had never viewed students when I taught as simply passive. I had never viewed schools as simply prisons. In other words, the reproductive logic in a way struck me as an outgrowth of a kind of elitist ideology that never took seriously not only the contradictions in terms of the spaces that people occupy, but also the multiple ways in which people insert themselves in the world and how they mediate that. So I started writing about resistance, and I wrote a book at that time called Theory and Resistance in Education. And that book I think had an enormous influence in the field. Although the field was dominated by a group of Marxists at the time that refused to publish it. Routledge was the dominant publisher, and I somehow got excluded from this group. But I always felt comfortable. I always felt that Woody Allen kind of modality served me well. And while I was attentive to the group, I always felt that these groups had a way of shutting down conversation rather than opening them up, because they weren't just linked to theoretical positions. They were also linked to the fact that these people often went to the same schools, like they graduated from Columbia, or they graduated from Ohio State, or they graduated from Wisconsin, and they followed each other around at conferences, and it had a kind of lemming-like quality to it that somehow turned me off. So that work progressed. It was very exciting because my classes then were packed with people. There were people coming from Harvard, there were people coming from Tufts. The word had spread that this theory was beginning to be articulated, and the fact that education was then in kind of a turmoil, my class became a kind of focal point. So I would walk into class in which I had 9 people registered, and there would be 100. And this was an enormous education for me, I mean, truly, because you couldn't be, there was nothing predictable about what could happen. And if you really were articulating a notion of critical pedagogy and education as a form of social justice, it was difficult to go in and begin to silence people. I mean, that didn't simply work well. So sometimes they got chaotic. I mean, people would get very upset, but what I did was very minor compared to what, of course, Howard Zinn was doing. Howard Zinn, at that time, would hold his classes in the auditorium, and everybody would come from all over the city. And Howard would come out, and he'd be just fabulous. I mean, to watch him, and oh God, I was just so struck. Because I think that as I'm regressing a bit, but I think it's important. I think that in growing up as a working class kid, the first battle that you really have to fight is that you're always defined by a lack. You're not defined by what the strengths you have. You're always defined by what you don't have. You're defined by the fact that you don't talk in the elaborated code. You're defined by the fact that you use double negatives. You're defined by the fact that you don't really write as well as kids who are trained in local elite prep schools. You're defined by the fact that you don't look as if you dress in a way that suggests you fit comfortably in the country club or the golf course. So you have to begin to sort of theorize these tensions and what it would mean within a community that is largely middle class, how you would define yourself as an academic, what you need basically to overcome to do that. And actually, before I went to BU, one of the things that I used to do, because I lived in Providence, Rhode Island, as I told you, I taught in high school earlier, I used to go to lectures. I used to just, walk across the street because they were public, right? And I remember the first time I saw William Kunstler. William Kunstler was, of course, a very famous radical lawyer, frumpy guy, I mean, he looked like he just rolled out of bed, every morning and put on the same suit, and the shirt was always wrinkled and his hair was flopping around. And I remember I had seen a series of Brown lectures. They're very typical, people always spoke as if they had a British accent. And, were utterly self-absorbed by narrating themselves. And one day there was a debate between Kunstler and this guy who probably was given birth in the cathedral at Oxford. And Kunstler was unreal. I mean, he just demolished the guy. And he would like swear. You know, he'd say, "Do you really believe this?" And I had never seen this before. I had never seen a working class intellectual. Never. I was shocked. I was shocked. I mean, I thought, wow. It just washed over me as if I had been cleansed. I mean, I thought to myself, that's interesting. We don't often hear about this. We don't often see this in official documentaries and narratives. Soon afterwards, Stanley Aronowitz came to Brown. He was late. And I remember sitting there, and he came in, and he was going to give a talk on Hegel and Marxism and social justice. And Stanley had looked as if he had just rolled out of bed. And he said, "I'm sorry I'm late. We got stuck in a snowstorm with my girlfriend, and we made love in the car." What? And I'm looking around, and all these brown kids suffering from what Wilhelm Reich would have called a major pelvic block. Had a lot of trouble sort of understanding that you could be an intellectual and somehow shred a certain kind of cultural capital. You could actually see it as a liability rather than as a strength. And he was brilliant. I mean, he was just brilliant. Never used a note, and never does when he gives lectures. And so I went up to him and I asked him a question, and we became friends. And it was the beginning of a very long friendship that, of course, still exists. He's 70. I'm 64, he's 70, 75. And so to speed forward a bit. So here I am at BU, sort of with Howard carrying around this legacy, writing this work, trying to negotiate the university. But I was still laboring under something that was quite false. And I was laboring under the assumption that if you did your work and you wrote and you published, then you would get tenure. And that's how it worked. That this was a liberal institution. This was 1977 to 1981. But at the time, Boston University had a new president, a guy named John Sober. And John Sober was a different kind of reactionary. He was an engaged reactionary. He didn't hide in the shadows and make decisions that crippled people's lives. He boasted about it. I mean, he made it very clear that people on the left were not going to get tenure at BU, the feminists, the people who did Frankfurt School theory, the people who, did Holocaust work. I mean, it was endless, right? Endless. And so I came up for tenure, went through the process unanimously at every level, and all of a sudden I was denied. I was denied tenure. And Howard organized and led a committee to protest this. There were letters came in from all over the world, Paulo Freire, Terry Eagleton, it's endless. My Iranian students, who were the best organizers I've ever seen in my life, were relentless outside the president's office every day. And so this started to attract a lot of attention. But Sober was like a bull, I mean, he prided himself on his inflexibility. And actually one student went to see him, and he told that student that over his dead body would I ever be given tenure. And then he finally invited me to see him. And it was really quite an experience. Although then I was ready for it. He had an office that was really modeled after the decor of the Romanov dynasty. So I was met by a black woman, basically in a black short skirt with a white thing, right out of 19th century slavery, a slave plantation. It was just remarkable. I looked, and he wasn't there. He was like, there was a staircase, the Scarlet Letters, what is it? I forgot the film. It was a plantation staircase. And he was at the top, and he had a deformity. His arm only came down to here. And he used to have his suits tailored so that, it would stick out, right? And of course, you could have shake, it was his right hand, you had to shake his right hand, and you got this kind of stump. So we were going to go into a room, and I didn't know at the time, but he had already made his decision. I found this out later. And he says, I hear you're such a great teacher. Why do you write such shit? And that was the opening salvo of my discussion with him. And it went on, and it got worse. And finally, we were just shouting at each other at some point. And finally, he said, look, I'll make a deal with you. He said, if you don't publish or write anything, if you don't publish anything for 2 years and allow me to be your personal tutor in, I forget what it was, in science, the history of science, education, or something else. He said, we'll maintain your salary for 2 years, and at the end, we'll reconsider you for tenure. And I was so, I wasn't too old, and I was about 38. I was flabbergasted, and I said, wow, what do you want to do, turn me into George Will? And he turned around and he faced the wall, and I left. I went back to my office, and I don't have a trust fund, and I thought, well, this is not good. I may be driving a taxi for the rest of my life here in Boston, which also, to tell you something about this place and how it works. I had a dean, and I remember when my father died, this dean said to me, he said, I was walking back to the campus shortly after this had happened, and he said, being denied tenure, and he said, did you have a lot of trouble handling the estate? I said, yeah, I did. I said, my father left $50 taped to a mirror on the back of $50 taped to the back of a mirror, and I had to pull it off. I mean, these people were so removed from any vestige of reality that it was kind of mind-blowing. But I applied for 50 positions, got a job at Miami University because of a left-oriented guy there who was just Richard Quantz, who I am forever indebted to. And from there, my career went on. I mean, I became a distinguished professor there. I wrote a number of books. Got a position at Penn State, which I regret having taken. I began working with two deans who I thought both were horrendous. Labored under very difficult times. I started a speaker series, and the first dean cut it off because it was attracting too much attention. We would bring in people like Larry Grossberg, Paul Gilroy, Stanley Aronowitz, Hazel Cobby. I mean, endless array of fabulous people, and they were packed. I mean, all these lectures would attract 100, 200, 300 people, right? But they became, the right wing mobilized and was, and I guess the point of that story is that what I learned is that not only is the university an intense site of struggle, but to presuppose for one moment that politics is trumped by virtue of intellectual production, by virtue of playing the rules of the game, I found entirely false. And I think that those sets of experience politicized me more than probably any other experience I had. I mean, it was very clear to me that in these positions, you fight for what you believe in. Hopefully you do it collectively, and you're more protected. But that, it's a difficult journey. And for me, it raises questions, of course, about upcoming generations of young people who increasingly have to face conditions that are even, I think, worse than they were when I began. That's for sure. I mean, tenure is now being considered a luxury. In the United States, only 30% of the people in the faculty have tenure, full-time positions. 70 have non-tenured or contract workers. 70%, and people often talk about the luxury of these jobs and how, isn't it, everybody's, they have summer vacations. But the fact of the matter is 70% of the workforce is contract labor. I mean, 70% of the workforce is being exploited in ways similar to the ways we talk about workers being exploited in the Pacific Rim. So, this is really quite a dire time. So other than that, I guess the last stage of this endlessly boring biography is that while I was at Penn State, it became increasingly clear to me that the United States was moving towards a mode of authoritarianism that I could no longer support, that I could no longer live in a country that in many ways was becoming, not Nazi Germany, I think that's nonsense, but was inventing a mode of authoritarianism that in many ways was increasingly as dangerous, particularly to the issue of democracy. And so we decided to leave. And we were lucky that McMaster University offered Susan and I jobs, and we had no trouble leaving. But I do remember that when I did leave, my dean then, even though I had endowed chair and was publishing far more than anybody in the faculty, refused to give me a counteroffer. He refused. I mean, he wouldn't even make a counter offer to, I thought that was so odd, He said, we should talk about this. And I sat down in a cafeteria, and he's talking about the weather and, all this kind of small talk. And I said, do we have something to talk about with respect to this job? He said, no. And he left. And I thought, this is the price you pay. This is not a romanticized story about my experiences. I think this is a story that suggests and has implications for experiences that hundreds of people go through, who have the courage to believe that education has something to do with taking risk, that in fact authority should be held accountable, that we should push the envelope around questions of social justice, that societies should be seen as never just enough, and that intellectuals have responsibilities, to say the very least, not just simply to produce knowledge, but in some ways do what they can to expand and deepen the possibilities of democracy itself. My father was a truck driver. He had a fourth grade education. My mother was a high school student who took pride in the fact that she somehow had learned to play the violin at some point in her life, and was also a tap dancer, which I thought was very interesting. I have a sister who is 4 years younger, who we knew each other, but because of the age difference and growing up in a working class, utterly hyper-masculine neighborhood, I really didn't get to know her until I left. I started working. We we're very close now, but I really didn't know her as a kid. My parents, I don't know what to say about my parents. My father, was a really sweet guy. He worked very, very hard, had a heart attack at 62 and died. My mother was sick most of her life. They were always very supportive about what I did. They had no trouble understanding my journey out of that neighborhood, which was a neighborhood I wanted to get out of. I never romanticized my background. There were things that I learned from it that I wouldn't give up, and precisely because of it, there are things I don't have to unlearn, and that's the greatest gift he gave me. There are things I don't have to unlearn. I don't have to unlearn a certain kind of arrogance. I don't have to unlearn a certain kind of hyper-individualism. I don't have to unlearn the need to narrate myself every minute when I speak to people. I don't have to unlearn the inability to make connections and recognize, that people matter. I think that my father was the most formidable influence in my life, far and away. And I'm not going to go into this, but there's one episode I will mention that changed my life. He was a mechanic. He's a car mechanic, right? And I remember one time I came home from college, and I had, I was feeling kind of, how do you say this? I was feeling kind of, I was infatuated with how much I was learning, and so I started to talk to him about Hegel or something, and he said, stop, look. He said, do you know how to take this engine apart? I said, I have no idea. He said, do you know how to change a lock in a car? He said, when you walk into a room and you flip on a light, he said, do you know who puts all those wires in the walls? Oh, man, no, I don't. He said, look, all I'm saying is I appreciate the knowledge you have. He said, but a lot of people have a lot of different forms of knowledge and make contributions in different ways. And he said, if you start that, he didn't use the word hierarchy, but he said, he was suggesting if you hierarchize these and associate the value of certain lives with certain degrees and certain forms of knowledge, he said, you're going to be really unhappy for the rest of your life. I was shocked. It was a bomb going off in my head. And there was something about it I never forgot. Never. It marked me forever. Just this gift that he gave me, that one insight was just phenomenal. Just phenomenal. But, I don't know. For me, the only research that really mattered in my life was research that linked theoretical rigor and social relevance. Research that in some way had something to say to the world. Research that, in a sense, was elevated to the status of being worldly. Worldly meaning that it took seriously the notion that people have unbelievable human potentialities and possibilities, and that first and foremost, research that seemed to matter was research that was organized around the theoretical principles that took seriously the primacy of the ethical and the political. And that kind of research always suggested that the work that we did should have some connection to the most central, the most urgent, the most important social problems of the time. So I was never one to indulge in a kind of research that it seemed to me didn't have a currency that spoke to public life, and particularly spoke to questions of agency and questions of democracy. I mean, I think that in some fundamental way, look, education is always a moral and political practice, because first and foremost, it's about the struggle over agency. Over agency. It's about the struggle over the lives we inhabit, the futures we imagine, the relationships that we engage in, the people that we work with. And that's even more so today because the question of responsibility is now globalized. You know, we have to re-theorize responsibility outside of small neighborhoods, outside of families. I mean, outside of the relationship of simply ourselves to the most immediate people in our lives. I mean, I think that, you know, we live in a world where all of this is so interconnected that this question of who's in, who's out, you know, who has the opportunity for a decent life, who can experience a life with dignity, is no longer something that can be separated from other parts of the world. So I mean, so the question of agency now takes on a kind of global significance, suggesting that the political and ethical parameters that drive the research that we do are equally far more important than they ever have been in the past. But I think there's another issue. I think the other issue is to recognize that this question of research has become utterly politicized in ways that we have never seen before, meaning that research is not merely about the work that one does in light of the problem that one sort of addresses. Research is also about the question of power and who can be bought and who can't. So what we often see is we see corporations, we see the Pentagon in the United States, you know, we see non-governmental sources coming into the university, and with the enormous funds that they have, they don't not only buy space, they buy consciences. And they drive research in a way that is actually antithetical to the notion of community and justice, that is antithetical to the notion of democracy. You know, research, for instance, that is aimed at creating more sophisticated, technologically computer-driven weapons, ray guns, you know, forms of surveillance that now can be organized around the construction of what looks like flies. You know, new ways to watch people and utterly control them. So I think that the question of research, while it often has a kind of neutral sounding ring to it, really is central and is at the heart of how we want to view the educational project. Because it seems to me that research doesn't come first in this discussion of education. The project comes first. What's the purpose and meaning of education? And that's what should drive research. And if the purpose and meaning of education is essentially to expand the possibilities for human agency, human possibilities, and democracy, then there's no place in the university for corporate money that, in a sense, is being used to undermine the environment. I mean, there's no place in the university for the kind of money that really is investing in death and profits rather than in human life. So for me, the question of research has always taken on a very political and ethical overtone. Well, I think that what critical inquiry does, I mean, as I said before, it takes seriously the primacy of the ethical and the political, right? It's the kind of work that is not only self-reflective about its own presuppositions, how it does, what it does, and under what circumstances, but it's utterly concerned about the consequences of what it does. I mean, so that when inquiry becomes critical, think about what that means. It means that it becomes critical in ways that suggest that the very nature of what we do should be scrutinized, always under question. But secondly, it raises questions about the object of that inquiry. And I would think that an inquiry that's critical is very discriminating about what it is it exactly wants to address. So that, for me, something is critical when, in fact, it links itself to the elimination of human suffering. It takes seriously those kind of ethical imperatives that suggest that it should open up the possibility of justice rather than close it down. That it should open up the possibility of allowing people to live in a world with dignity rather than close those parameters down. So critical inquiry is, in a sense, it does a number of things. One, it's self-critical. 2, it takes seriously the relationship between what is and what ought to be. It's based on a language of not only critique, but a language of possibility. Thirdly, it says that authority should always be accountable, that power should be accountable, that central to any notion of inquiry is the notion of power in politics, and that power should be accountable. Fourthly, it takes very seriously the question of what kind of conditions in our research can we produce that maximizes the capacities for people to intervene in the world in ways in which they are not just governed by the world, but actually can learn how to govern it themselves. In other words, how do we maximize the possibility for human agency individually and collectively? And finally, there is the most important question of all. What does it mean to recognize that the question of research and the question of education and the question of critical inquiry, to become meaningful, cannot simply narrate itself in ways that suggest it's interviewing itself? I mean, what does it mean to become worldly? How do we emphasize its public connections in ways that take seriously the question of dignity, social justice, and the elimination of human suffering? I mean, in the broadest possible way, those kinds of elements point to something else. They point to a notion of critical inquiry that mocks the intellectual as a publicly engaged intellectual. That mocks the institutions in which he or she work as institutions that always should be under scrutiny, that mocks a space that is never restricted to the university, but always suggests that it's something that has to act as a translating device between the university and the larger world. I mean, critical inquiry has to, in a sense, take seriously its possibilities for translation, for linking the private to the public, or as Zygmunt Bauman has said endlessly in his work, for allowing us to understand how private considerations are basically linked to public issues, and how public issues bear an impact on individual issues. I mean, this is an absolutely crucial issue, it seems to me, at a time when the social is under attack everywhere. When the social state is under attack, when any notion of compassion is under attack, when all forms of social solidarity that matter, that can't be measured simply in profit or financial terms, are viewed disparagingly as a dependency of some sort, where weakness is now relegated to a notion of scorn, where everybody's on the island, you know. And when you live in a world in which social Darwinism becomes the primary motif for how individuals should relate to each other, it seems to me that the question of social inquiry, which always emerges, by the way, in particular social formations and context, has to take seriously what it means to address that. Social inquiry is not a method. Social inquiry is always the outcome of particular struggles. And it seems to me not to recognize that is to lend it a notion of objectivity that neutralizes and depoliticizes the very notion of inquiry itself, and in doing so often makes the arbiter of that inquiry complicitous with the worst injustices. Well, I think that what critical pedagogy does is it takes those broader considerations, linking learning to social change, being concerned about questions of agency, developing a language of critique and possibility, and it situates that in a notion of teaching critical pedagogy that in some way validates both, it validates pedagogy, let's say, as a moral and political practice. You know, one that takes seriously what it means to provide the educational conditions within classrooms and elsewhere for really giving students the opportunity to become agents, and not just simply to experience themselves as the objects of forms of education in which the question of training becomes paramount, right? We don't empower students, but we provide the conditions, I think, for students to understand what it would mean to have the kind of power by virtue of the knowledge that they have and the skills that they need to be able to enter the world in a way in which they really believe they can somehow change it, and not just simply accommodate. Well, I think that, you know, pedagogy as a disciplined form of intervention in a particular learning site with the intent of preparing people for the world has a long history. It certainly goes back to the Greeks. But I think that the question of critical pedagogy as a distinct political, ethical, and theoretical movement really takes on a great significance I don't want to say begins, but takes on an enormous significance, particularly in the United States and North America, post-Dewey, post the social reconstructionists. And it really begins, I believe, with Paulo Freire. I think that Paulo Freire became a model as a result of the literacy campaigns that he organized in Brazil in the 1950s and the 1960s for recognizing that pedagogy was absolutely central to the formation of particular kinds of political subjects, and that the question of pedagogy was ultimately a moral and political practice simply by virtue of the fact that it took seriously that politics was about the acquisition of a particular form of agency and the ability to imagine a particular type of future. But what Paulo did that was interesting was he didn't say that pedagogy was something that was necessary for the elite. Paulo said that pedagogy was something that was absolutely essential for those who had often been marginalized and had been powerless. So there was a link now between pedagogy and not just learning in ways that could be applied to students from the middle class, the ruling classes, the working class. He said pedagogy first and foremost was central for working class and marginalized people because without a sense of education, you lacked a sense of agency. Without a sense of agency, you lacked the power to imagine a different future. Without imagining a different future, you couldn't act on that future. So he took that seriously. And I think that what then happens is that while Paulo's work was translated by a number of people who were largely concerned about literacy in the 1960s. Jonathan Kozel, for instance, was one of the first American advocates for Paulo Freire's work. All of a sudden, something else emerged. In the 1970s, in the 1960s, you have the student revolts taking place over free speech, the end of those revolts, the emergence of SDS, the emergence in the universities of the civil rights movements. And all of a sudden the question of education is getting a lot of play, but in a very general sense. It cuts across disciplines. Now within the field of education itself, something begins to happen. The sociology of education that really begins in England with people like Jeff Whitty and a number of other people, all of a sudden is being taken up in the United States in a way that even Jeff Whitty wrote at one time was far more political than what was happening in the United States, in England. And I think that all of a sudden critical pedagogy, particularly in the 1970s in the United States and at OISE in Canada, begins to develop as its own formation. Ed Sullivan has a story that I wish I could confirm, but I'm not sure I can. But he claims that the term actually emerged in a meeting between myself, Roger Simon, him, he claims Michael Apple was there, and a number of other people. And we were trying to figure out how to talk about a book that I published in my series at that time with Bergen and Garvey. Paulo and Freire and I were co-editors of a series with Bergen and Garvey. And we were going to call it Critical Theory of Education, after Habermas, right? But we decided, no, we'll call it Critical Pedagogy. Now that's a great story. I hope it's true. And if it is, it adds a certain sort of romance to the beginning of the term. But the fact of the matter is, the practices, the theories, the theoretical elements, the ways, the relationship between school and society were being theorized, that had been going on for quite some time. The term that was used to particularly name it was something else. I think then what we saw a series of places throughout the United States in particular that began to educate people around questions of critical pedagogy. And all of a sudden books were being written, articles were being published. And I think that one of the things, Michael Apple, of course, had a series at Routledge that was very important. Paulo Freire and I had a series at Bergen and Garvey that was very important. And we went out of our way to publish people that couldn't be published in traditional presses. But we went particularly out of our way to publish people who we knew would not get tenure unless they had books. So we were very concerned, not because they weren't talented, but because they were writing in areas that were controversial. There just simply weren't the outlets for them. So we must have, that Bergen and Garvey series must have published 200 books, at least. We then had a series with Priscilla Ross, who was a fabulous editor at SUNY. Peter McLaren and I had a series, and we put that together. We published again, many, many people. I think that after the, I mean, in the early stages of what critical pedagogy represented, in my estimation, I mean, people like Roger Simon were utterly brilliant. I mean, Bill Pienaar played a role. Apple played a role. I played a role, modest role. But it had an impact. I mean, I think that particularly in the 80s, in the 90s, it changed the way we think about education. No question. I mean, I think that the traditional positivist or liberal models of education now had to contend, at least had to contend with a discourse that had never been there before, that all of a sudden raised questions about absences in their discourses and consequences for their discourses that up to that point had not been dealt with. But there were risks, there were prices to be paid, all around. I mean, my story about tenure at BU was repeated by endless numbers of people. But I remember when I published, I was doing Theory and Resistance, and I had the manuscript, right? And I sent it to the University of Chicago. And the editor was very, very, very excited about this book. I mean, he's a young guy, and he said, "Oh, don't worry, we'll get this published." And then one day I get a call, and he says, "Oh, I don't know, I feel terrible about this." He said, "Unfortunately, somebody from the faculty at the University of Chicago has to read the manuscript and approve it." And while I'm not going to mention the name, this was a very famous guy in education whom I had encountered at a conference, a panel at AERA, who had given a speech in the early 1980s attacking critical education and critical pedagogy and the work particularly of Bill Pienaar. And I got up and I responded to him. And there's no question in my mind that that book was lost because of him, no question. And so I think that, I mean, I have a lot of a heartfelt feeling for a lot of young people then who emerged, who were working in a discourse for which they knew they could lose their jobs. I mean, they knew that they would not be published in Educational Researcher. They knew that there were a whole range of educational journals that dominated the field that it was very difficult to be published in. I mean, even when they started publishing, it was because they couldn't keep us out anymore. Harvard Educational Review, I mean, I published a lot of pieces in Harvard Educational Review, so many, in fact, that some of the faculty at one point from the Harvard Graduate School of Education actually tried to get the editors, the student editors, removed from the journal so it could be controlled by the faculty. They were so upset over them publishing Paulo Freire, me, Donaldo Macedo, who played an enormous role in the emergence of critical pedagogy in the United States. Peter McLaren played, in his own way, a very significant role. It was very difficult for us to get published. I mean, but when we did, the repercussions were always endless. So this is an ongoing narrative about the notion that pedagogy is really, truly an outgrowth of struggle, and you really see that with critical pedagogy. Yeah, I think that I'll define it by comparing it with what I see as the traditional notion of teaching. Teaching often is about taking an a priori body of knowledge and applying it in ways to suggest that what teaching really is about is a methodology. It's a method. It's an utterly instrumentalized application of knowledge that's a given to students who will then incorporate that knowledge through the methods of teaching. And we can, you start with an objective, you evaluate. I mean, the classic is Ralph Tyler's method, right? I mean, and I think that what pedagogy does is it begins, first of all, with the absolute rejection of that presupposition, that teaching is not a method, that teaching actually is a moral and political practice, that it involves certain theoretical assumptions about the interface between power, between knowledge, between students' social experiences, between history, the histories that students bring. It has generated a whole series of categories, the category of voice, the category of overdetermination, reproduction, the hidden curriculum. It has produced its own vocabulary. It is utterly politicized without politicizing the space of schooling. So I think that when we talk about pedagogy, we're talking about the relationship between knowledge and power. We're talking about the ways in which students figure very predominantly in the learning process itself. We're talking about teachers who have to be actively aware of their own histories and what they bring to the teaching process. And we're talking about the articulation of ideology to experience in ways that open up the possibility for learning rather than close it down, particularly critical learning, living in the East Side. I was a high school teacher, right? And we were having study groups on Lukács. We were high school teachers. And we would, and I remember history and class consciousness was translated into English. We got in a car at 6 at night, braved the Boston traffic, drove to a radical bookstore in Harvard Square, they had 4 copies, there were 4 of us, we bought them out, rushed back and read the book for like a month. I mean, it was a very, unlike now, where, I mean, the question of investing in one particular form of print culture is almost unimaginable to some kids, right? But we were on fire politically, and when I went to BU, I discovered that all these people were there who actually, connected to the people I most admired. I mean, Max was friends with Herbert Marcuse, and I was going to meet him, and he died. I couldn't believe it. He died in Germany. Of all the places, he didn't want to be buried in Germany. He actually requested that he not be buried in Germany. But I mean, Marcuse had an enormous influence on my life. Enormous. I can't tell you. I mean, actually, there's a small story about cultural capital that I think you would really enjoy. Part of your life as a working class kid, I think, is often organized around confronting problems once you step outside of the luxury of your neighborhood that you can't imagine exist. A world where the symbols, the gestures, the rituals, the disciplines are entirely foreign to you. And there was a period in my life when I was involved with a very ruling class woman. I actually married her, but we got divorced. And it was not meant to be. And I went to a house, and her mother descended from the staircase, and in some kind of gown. Her father was the chair of the English department of Brown University. And we sat around, and she said, the thing that we usually do here at dinner is we all begin by talking about our favorite novelist. And I thought, oh no, oh my God. I couldn't believe this was happening to me, that they were actually going to come to me and ask me to begin to explicate, I was reading Jack Kerouac, I think, But I left that house that night thinking, I have to learn this language, I mean, that this language is punishing. It has a punishing quality to it. You have to learn the elaborated code. And I remember I went home to my 3rd floor apartment in the East Side, and I was reading One Dimensional Man. And I stayed up all night. And I read every line. And I remember, I've got to learn how to talk like this. I've got to learn this language, And it was kind of a turning point for me, because I really have 2 languages, right? You really have the elaborated code and you have the restricted code. And people often say, oh, it's just amazing how you talk, this kind of silliness. And yet for me, nothing amazing about it at all. I mean, it's actually about the outgrowth of a kind of struggle in which if you don't become multiply literate, you can't survive. Particularly when you're on the receiving end of a kind of discourse that punishes you if you don't know it. Right? I mean, so you really have to learn, very important, to understand the registers of human interaction as they're interfaced with matters of race, class, gender. I mean, it's this is not, as some Marxists would say, a purely surface issue. That this is phenomena. That's nonsense. This is really about the stuff of agency. It's about the stuff of connection. It's about the stuff of understanding. It's about being in the dialogue somehow. And if not, being able to stop a dialogue, particularly when that dialogue borders on terrorism. Bourdieu was right about questions of distinction and about questions of symbolic violence. Symbolic violence can be as deadly as material violence. The way people can destroy you by humiliating you, that isn't the right pronunciation. Don't you know your history? I mean, this kind of stuff. We've all sort of experienced this. But this is a political issue around questions of language. And for me, that was crucial. And the Frankfurt School educated me. No question. I mean, in Theory and Resistance, the first chapter I wrote was the application of Frankfurt theory to educational theory. That was my first chapter in the book. It took me an entire year to do the research for that, to read as a working class kid, totally untrained in philosophy, to be able to master that, to just go through it, learn how to research it, learn, particular research methods, which, as Maya will tell you, I've mastered. I mean, in terms of my own capacities, and so it's very important, So I mean, I think that when we talk about research and we talk about language, all of these things are situated within social/biographical formations. So I don't believe that these questions exist externally in ways in which we can separate them from the places we've come from, or from the institutions that have official legitimations about what counts and what doesn't. I mean, endless numbers of people have been fired in universities because they're not positivist, right? Because they don't believe in the end the questions of mathematical regularity are really what matter in education. And I've just never believed. I read, I'll tell you what I did first. I mean, I did something history. I didn't read the Frankfurt School initially. Initially, I read the histories of the Frankfurt School. I read Martin Jay. I read David Held. And then I decided to read Adorno. And I read Adorno and Horkheimer, of course, right? I read Marcuse. I read Leo Lowenthal. I loved Erich Fromm. So I read all the people who were accessible to me. The person I didn't read and spend enough attention with was Benjamin. I read Benjamin later when I was at Miami University. We had study groups around Benjamin. But at that point, there was also an emergence of a very different kind of theoretical discourse taking place. And that was when Foucault was now beginning. The Foucaultian movement was beginning, Derrida. And some of that was a little too ethereal for me. I read it, but but like anything else, and I think this might lead into a question you're asking. I don't read theorists because I don't treat theory as a form of theoreticism. I don't treat theory as an end in itself. I don't treat it as a commodity that should be valued by virtue of how fashionable it is. What I do is I read across boundaries because I see theory as a resource. So I read from different theoretical traditions in light of the problems that I'm addressing. So if I'm writing about youth, there may be something in Adorno that Benjamin in particular, in the radio lectures that he gave on youth in the 1930s, the early 1920s, I might find useful. But that doesn't mean I'm a Benjamin scholar. Do you understand? I don't say, well, I'm a Foucauldian. I'm a Derridian. My research begins with an issue. And from there, I look at the vast amount of possibilities and sources that might inform both the project I'm taking up and how I do it. Everything I read, I cut and paste. And what that means is that the first thing I do is I get a text and I read it and I mark passages that are enormously important and I put an organizing idea beside those passages. I then cut out, I copy the reading, I then cut out those passages, and what I do is I put the organizing, the article, the book, the organizing idea, the paragraphs, right? Then I duplicate them, then I read them again, and I make a cover page of the major ideas. And everything, well, I can't show you because it'd be awkward, but everything is then organized. So everything I read 3 times, generally. Because I find that a first reading is never enough. And a second reading, there's usually too much to deal with. And a third reading, I get it. And then what I often do if I'm working on a project is I will put a cover board up and I will tape the front page, the front pages to the board to try to see relationships that I haven't seen before. Because to me, the essence of writing is not reproducing what somebody has already said, but finding a relationship that nobody has quite understood. And you yourself have not found, but need to produce to make the subject all the more relevant. So my research works in that area. My research has gone over the years, has followed a trajectory. It's very difficult for me when people will say things like, "What's your best book?" That's a meaningless question for me because not because I've written a lot of books, but because my writing, my research has gone through different periods of concern. So, I mean, how could I, if there was a period in my life when I wrote 4 books on youth, because I felt that the question of youth was central to the question of democracy. And I was alarmed at how few academics were taking up the question of youth and youth struggles. So I wrote a book on Disney. I wrote a book, called The Abandoned Generation. I mean, a number of books. But that was one period in my life. And I mean, it really begins with critical pedagogy and critical theory in the 1970s. I moved from there to the question of cultural studies. And in dealing with the question of cultural studies, I take up the question of public pedagogy. I no longer want to look simply at schools. I also now want to look at the way in which learning takes place, primarily in a culture in which schools may be actually secondary as an educational site to what kids really learn, or what everybody learns. So I moved from that to questions of cultural studies. Then I got very specific, and I moved to questions of youth. And I did 5 books on youth. From there, I took up the question of the spectacle and questions of terrorism. And I wrote a book called Beyond the Spectacle of Terrorism, as you know. And then from there, and basically organizing, my research is increasingly being organized around something I got from Zygmunt Bauman. Zygmunt Bauman has been an enormous influence in my life. As important as Paulo Freire, Stanley Aronowitz, who's been an enormous influence in my life, theoretically enormous, Hannah Arendt. But Bauman, to me, did something nobody else did. Bauman took this vast expanse of knowledge that could not simply be situated within a discipline. And he began to weave this knowledge through an exploration of everyday life, but also its connection to a larger globalized world. And as I think he once said, but it may not be fair to say this as a quote, I think he once said, I walk into the same room through a lot of different doors. And I think that's exactly what I do. I find that, for instance, the work that I'm doing now, I wrote a book on, the work on disposability is taken from a book he did called Wasted Lives, which I find to be just a fabulous book. And what I tried to do after doing the book on youth, the work on youth, I tried to understand how neoliberalism as a theory actually was not being taken up as a mode of cultural politics, but was entirely being reduced to a set of economic analysis. And I thought that was wrong. I thought that to understand neoliberalism, you had to look at the question of common sense. And of course, Antonio Gramsci was also another great influence in my life. You had to understand how common sense worked as a mode of public pedagogy. But you also had to understand its most dire consequences, which was that now, with the collapse of the social state, we have entire populations that are considered disposable. Just disposable. They just don't matter anymore. And Katrina was, to me, the absolute exemplary model for this. And I wrote a book on Katrina. Then I looked at the work I just finished, 2 things I just finished. Then I wrote a book. I wanted to figure out how the logic of disposability actually works through the university. So I wrote a book on the militarization and the commodification, the corporatization of the university, a book called The University in Chains. I wanted to figure out how the military-industrial academic complex now constituted a major force in shaping generations of students for whom the logic of disposability would be acceptable. That would be an absolute motif of everyday life that would go unchallenged in the realm of neoliberal common sense. And then I just finished another book called Against the Terror of Neoliberalism, which is, again, an attempt to understand the relationship between neoliberalism and authoritarianism, and to understand the relationship, the growing authoritarianism of the United States, and the growing various forms of fundamentalism, and an attempt to really grapple seriously with neoliberalism as a mode of common sense, as a form of public pedagogy. And the work I'm doing now my next project is to look at 3 or 4 theorists who provide a kind of theoretical foundation for looking at questions of disposability, and then to focus the logic of disposability entirely on the question of youth, and to see how that works. Another person who has deeply influenced me is Edward Said. And not only because of the range of his work, but of his commitment to the concept of public intellectual. And how seriously he took what he called the act of translation as a matter of responsibility, right? I mean, and he said, hey, look, you have to be able to communicate with people. You know, you have to write in a way that doesn't compromise theoretical complexity, but is accessible to your audiences. And I think for me, I just have tried very hard over the years to make my discourse just more accessible. I mean, without compromising the theoretical foundations of that discourse. I mean, people who often argue that, you know, if you write in an accessible way, you can't possibly be saying anything important theoretically, strikes me as an enormous form of, it's not even ignorance, it's the active refusal to assume responsibility for their own work, right? And I just find myself reading too much work. I can't read it. I mean, honestly, I shouldn't admit this on tape. I just can't read it. I mean, I find it impenetrable. I find that they're speaking to an audience of 4, you know, 3 of whom are in their family. You know, it's just impenetrable. And I think that what you often find, and I find it here with graduate students. I mean, I find students constantly being educated in a discourse that closes them off rather than connects them with public life. I mean, there seems to be the need to value writing and scholarship by virtue of how impenetrable it is, rather than what kind of theoretical and political work it actually does that might be able to educate people who are not in the field you're in, who do not occupy academia. Well, I think that what we need to do is we need to, first of all, attack the notion of theoreticism, that the only purpose to be here is to learn more, to value theory to such a degree that the only thing we should do is imitate it, right? And to presuppose that the only theorists who matter are those who are the most opaque. Secondly, I think we need to suggest that, look, they need to be educated in ways that highlight a choice for them. You know, and one of the choices that we need to stress that it's important to be a public intellectual. I mean, it's important to connect to the world. It's important to see your work as having a significance outside of the isolated seminar at MLA. That there is a way to connect, to learn how to write for different audiences. My argument for clarity is not an argument that would suggest there's one standard of writing. Actually, my argument is to recognize that there are a multiplicity of audiences, and you should be able to cross those borders and write for every one of them. But at least acknowledge that in writing for all of them, you're expanding the possibility for your audience rather than closing it down. I don't like the term. I don't use it anymore. Yeah, I don't like it because I think that it's been both complicated and overused and generalized in a way that it's both lost its theoretical and political gravity, and it's become so amorphous that it now can be applied to anything that seems to characterize that period with the rise of mass technology and electronics and new media and anything post-1945. So I don't use it. I'm more inclined to talk about the mix of modernity, modern and, you know, let me put this differently. I'm probably more inclined to go with somebody like Bauman. I guess what I'm trying to avoid in a very clumsy way here is I'm trying to avoid a kind of periodization that would suggest a break, as much as I'm trying to complicate the social formations in which we now find ourselves. To suggest that there's no difference between what was imperialism, for instance, in the 1940s and the conditions that produced it, and the way in which global capital works now, I think is absolutely wrong. Conditions have changed. The key is to mark those conditions. Personally, I'm indebted more to Raymond Williams than I am to most people around this issue. I mean, I think there are elements of the culture that are residual. I think there are elements of the culture that are traditional, and I think there are elements of the culture that are emergent. And I think it behooves us to mark in a complicated way both the relationships between those elements and how they configure something that we need to address that produces new problems. So rather than simply go to the postmodern, the question for me is, what is it about the global political sphere that needs to be marked that is distinctive and unlike anything we have seen before, that therefore demands a new politics and a new language for that politics. And so that would be the entry that I would go in. Now, I would take. Now, at the same time, I think that Zygmunt is very right in pointing to the collapse of the social state, what he calls liquid modernity, this massive sense of insecurity and indeterminacy that has now come to mark all aspects of social life, which in itself is a political analysis. I mean, he's talking about the collapse of the social state. He's talking about the rise of neoliberalism. So for me, I would like to say something like we live in a neoliberal age, you know, that the age is marked by the rise of new modes of fundamentalism. So I would rather provide characteristics of that age and talk about how they relate to the past, rather than provide these categories that are so neat and so clean and so uncomplex and so generalized that in the end they really don't tell us very much. I think that first and foremost, education, to have any theoretical and political gravity at all, has to be linked to the question of democracy. We educate people to live in a democracy. Education is the foundation for developing the capacities, the skills, and the knowledge to be able to not only recognize the importance of democracy. Democracy is an artifice. Democracy is not a given. It's something that's socially, politically, and historically constructed. It comes and it goes. And it's not something that exists by virtue of a transcendent force. It's not something that Allah bestows. It's not something that God bestows. It's not something that emerges out of a certain kind of religious justification. It's something that's struggled over. And unless people struggle over it, it disappears. Just as the people who occupy those countries for which democracy doesn't exist disappear. And it seems to me that one of the greatest challenges that education faces today is to justify and define itself as a democratic public sphere, as one of the few left that can both engage, remind, and educate people that we live in very dangerous times, that the earth is not only periled by virtue of all the forces, a variety of anti-democratic forces, but that unless we educate people to think in terms that suggest a relationship between the self and the other, marked by a democratic ethos enacted on a global level, we don't have a lot of time left. So I guess I not only am arguing that education as a project gets its meaning by virtue of its willingness to educate people to live in a critical and inclusive democracy, but that the urgency of the problem demands a responsibility from educators and others that we have never seen before. Because education is being sabotaged. In the United States, we don't have education any longer. We have training. We don't educate people to be critical. We educate people to take tests. We do everything we can to eliminate education as a democratic public sphere. We bring in corporations who advertise to students in bathrooms, in multiple places. We bring in teachers who are overworked and de-skilled. We bring in corporations that now speak about education as if they actually know something about it. You know, we bring in military recruiters to, in a sense, take off the streets poor young black and white kids to become fodder for a war that never should have taken place. So it seems to me that when we look at education today, we're looking at not only something that talks about the crisis of learning, but talks about the crisis of youth, and finally talks about the crisis of democracy. You know, I think there are a couple of issues here that are important around the question of pedagogy and what you're getting at, and I'll end with this. You know, first of all, look, in the larger world in which we live, it seems to me that when I make the claim that we need a new language, one of the things I would claim is central to that development of that language is that we have to recognize that you can't talk about the political without talking about the pedagogical. That questions of pedagogy are central to any notion of politics, because the question of agency is foundational to politics. You can't talk about politics unless you talk about agency. You can't do it. If you abstract agency from politics, what in fact you end up with is a population that's utterly depoliticized. Just as you, in an age of globalization, you can't abstract power from politics, although we do it, right? As Bauman has said repeatedly, we now live in an age in which politics is local and power is global. And that has created a series of conditions that it seems to me anybody who takes critical education seriously is going to have to think about. That raises new questions about the question of the globalization of critique, responsibility, and intervention, and citizenship. But I think moving from there to your point, I have a very odd I think, take on this. I don't want to use the word control because I think control is a terrible word, and you're right, it should be banished. And certainly that should not be the primacy of our concerns when we walk into classrooms. But I want to defend as ardently as I can the notion that education is directive. It has a project. It has goals. That, we don't just walk in and say, hey, let's do anything. You want to talk? Let's talk. I don't think that's what education is about. I think education is always directive. The question here is, how can it become directive in a way that empowers people and expands their capacity for intervention, and then shaping the very nature of the education they're involved in, rather than closing it down? So I'm not one to argue for forms of education that seem to suggest that matters of judgment, discrimination, thoughtfulness, and the conditions for enacting the possibilities for really being able to, for instance, allow people to learn something outside of what they already know isn't essential. I think it's essential. I think that education should unsettle people. I think that it should jostle everything they know. I think it should force them to delve into themselves in ways in which the most fundamental dimensions of who they are can be questioned. I think it should put them in exile. I think pedagogy should put people in exile. They should occupy a place that they're not familiar with, so that they can make the familiar, so that the strange all of a sudden can become familiar. That they should constantly be placed in positions where what's being juxtaposed are voices that unsettle the authoritative nature of what they think they know. Because that then translates into unsettling the authoritative nature of what anybody knows. And it means that you all of a sudden live in a culture and work in a culture in which you not only are engaged in an active exchange for which questioning matters, but also accountability. Right? And secondly, I'm not concerned about forms of education, liberal forms of education, that simply claim they want to make people critical. I don't think it's enough. You have to also make them responsible and accountable. Accountable. And I don't mean accountable in the way that Bush does. I mean accountable in that when you argue a position, that position signifies certain kinds of social relationships. And those social relationships signify something about ethics. Signifies something about one's relationship to the other. It signifies something about the consequences of what we do. So my classes, how do you say it? My classes are not comfort zones for people who want to be stroked. My classes are classes that begin with the presupposition that to dignify them as students, I have to take seriously what they say and give them the opportunity to say it. But by doing that, also hold them accountable for what they say, so that there is an ongoing exchange, never humiliating, clearly, never threatening students' identities, but at the same time saying you can be more than this, you can think beyond this, that there's something else. And I think that does justice to students. I think that in the end, something is learned both about what it means to engage in a pedagogical encounter that dignifies you, but also what it means to be in a world in which everybody doesn't speak with a British accent. A world in which you have to respond quickly, a world in which questions are posed and issues are raised and relationships are legitimated, that you should feel comfortable in intervening in, even though you don't feel comfortable in being there. Well, okay. Look, I think there are a couple of issues. Let me go back to your initial, because the issue, the question has 3 or 4 parts, right? And it seems to me, in the first instance, you're talking about a context in which you find yourself saying things that are at odds with official interpretations of how the world works. And what we often find in those settings, and in many ways students are often shocked to find, is that there's not only resistance, but there is the possibility they could be fired, that journalists will pick it up. You're in the news. It happened to me repeatedly when I was in high school, actually. And and you don't know what to do, right? So I think the first thing we need to do is to educate students about the fact that these things happen, right? That, if you're going to be on the side of justice, you're going to be on the side of taking risk, you're going to be on the side of talking about controversial issues. You have to find ways to do this that both protect yourself and at the same time make sure you're not isolated, meaning you have to develop contacts in the community, meaning that you have to politically work with other faculty so that you can mobilize together if in fact a very threatened principal suggests that he's going to fire you because you've said something in the classroom that you shouldn't have said. So you need to understand that the setting in which we work is not one in which you simply close the door and do anything you want, because that doesn't exist. That world doesn't exist anymore, if it ever did. So we have to prepare students politically for how to deal with what it means to take risks in classrooms. Secondly, it seems to me that we need to take very seriously in the classes in which we teach two things. One is that it's hard to imagine anybody being in education who doesn't believe that hope is the precondition for possibility and for agency and for creating a better world. I don't know why people would be in education if in fact they don't believe that education plays a fundamental role in fact highlighting the contradiction between what is and what ought to be. I mean, everything that we do implies in some fundamental way something about the future. And the question is, whose future? You know, I mean, is it like a daydream? And if it's like a dream, is it a bad dream or a good dream? I mean, how do we position ourselves as intellectuals to take up the question of what it means to educate people to either adapt to a particular kind of future, already one that's simply replicates the existing society in which they find themselves, or are capable of creating a future in which they can be comfortable, one that correlates with what they believe in. Secondly, you can't do this without recognizing that this is like an act of war. I mean, although that's much too harsh, but this is battle. You know, we're battling over ideas. I mean, we're battling over different understandings of how the world works. Power is never absent from these discussions, either by virtue of the people who intervene, who try to shut you down, the David Horowitzes of the world, who really believe that any alternative opinion is unpatriotic or in the United States or un-American. So we have to educate people not simply to be driven by the mastery of knowledge. We have to in some way inculcate in them the need to recognize that knowledge has something to do with power, and knowledge and power has something to do with, in some way, fighting for a particular kind of future. And finally, to do that means it's difficult. It's not easy, and that you have to be political to do that. You have to understand the exegesis of living in a political world, and not just defining yourself as a teacher. You know, you're not just a teacher. And I think that what we often have to recognize is that you can never talk about teaching without talking about the institution and political formations in which it takes place. So I tell students, you're going to teach somewhere, you don't just, you canvass the community. You talk to other teachers. You find out what kind of rules are in place. You find out who's been fired lately and why. You find out how power works. You don't just walk in and say, I'm going to walk into a classroom and teach. Now, some students may say, we don't have the luxury for that, that we need to eat. And they're right. And in some cases they don't. But those questions should never be far from their minds. They can never separate the politics of pedagogy from the politics of the institutional conditions that actually constrain or enable it. Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's something interesting here. I always tell students, look, when you talk about rules, there are people who talk about rules too. Rules that you follow the rules. Right. Then there are rules for, and there are rules for thinking about social responsibility. There are rules for thinking about your relationship to others, and you need to somehow find a way to put these together. I think that most students leave the universities in which they live for 3 or 4 years, and are totally unprepared for the political world that they're going to face. They're totally unprepared for the salaries. They're totally unprepared for the institutional politics. They're totally unprepared for the kinds of students that they get. They live a very comfortable life, and I think that there's something about the nature of that comfort that's deceptive and undermines the tools and the skills that they need, if not the knowledge, to be able to confront education as a vastly complicated battlefield over what the future might look like. No. For me, it was. I must tell you, I can remember walking out of that room and thinking to myself, I have a choice. I can live on my knees, or I can live standing up, and I'm not going to live on my knees. And when I went to my next job, which was at Miami University, and I didn't have tenure. I went without tenure. There was a group of conservative educators there who were trying to block me again. But I had a feminist dean, believe it or not, and an unbelievable feminist chair. Oh, 2 women in my life who were just like angels. They were like, each one occupied a shoulder. and they protected me, and I got it. But the fact of the matter is I never compromised again. The fact of the matter is I wasn't asking myself, what should I say to please these people, you know? The fact of the matter is I wasn't being intransigent to the point of being silly, because you know you have to negotiate the terrain in which you live. But I never knelt down anymore, and I never believed that I would be rewarded for the work I did. I did what I did, and then I fought for what I did. That's a very different tactic. I fought to legitimate what I did. I never stood like in the plantation and said, please, master, you know, what would you like? Would you like me to do quantitative research? Would you like me to do empirical research? Would you like me to be published in like the right journals? I mean, are there particular presses I should publish in? I didn't do it, and I never have. I mean, if you look at the books in which I published with Paradigm Press, I mean, I published with alternative publishers. I published a book in Canada with Arbiter Ring. It's an anarchist press. I could publish with presses much larger than that, but I make decisions about where I want to lend my work and what I believe in ways that are compatible with the principles that I have. And I think that that's not a, you know, you don't ask more of that from yourself. But at the same time, it's a good principle to sort of organize your life, because I don't want to wake up in the morning hating the work I do. I don't want to wake up in the morning thinking, oh God, another day in which my principles are utterly compromised, you know, another day in which I look back in 20 years and what have I contributed? Nothing. You just can't do that. I mean, I think you have to stress not merely the silly notion that education is about getting a job. It's also about having a life and offering to others a life with dignity and justice. And I think that when it becomes a vocation and not a job, something happens. Something changes, you know, about both your relationship to where you work and what you do and to others, and to the kinds of conditions that you want students to be prepared for, that will hopefully allow them to make similar kinds of decisions in their own interest.
Well, what a wonderful, wonderful story to end on. It's all about integrity, and it's hopeful. It's a
Good.
hopeful story to end on, and I really appreciate that.
That's all right. My pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time, and thank you, Maya, for really helping us set it up and the rest of it.
My pleasure.
Really, really good.
Oh no, it's my pleasure. You bet.
We've got a book contract with Finland. What we do at the beginning of each chapter is we try to take a quote from part of the interview. I would like to use the quote, I can either live on my knees or I can live standing up. I would like to use that.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Yes, I would. You know,
Just like that.
Sorry.
We might each choose a quote then. But anyway.
Well, okay, use yours. But that's the one I
That is a
really want to
wonderful.
use.
No, that for me, I mean, Robert, I'll tell you, I mean, just as a point of personal history, I mean, that quote, I can't tell you how much it resonates with my life, you know, and my experience in academia. I mean, even Maya, like I have this fabulous assistant, I work like a dream, you know. I mean, so much integrity. I mean, when you find yourself working with people who model the same principle.
Yes, yeah.
You know, you realize you've made a decision that matters, but you need something to grab onto that sometimes in what appears to be the most simplistic aphorism actually resonates in a very powerful way, right? Mm-hmm. You know, this is where the restricted code for me, I mean, in some sense works, because it captures something so complex in such a way that it's like you say, wow, of course, right? Of course I don't want to live on my knees, you know. And I think sometimes we need something to remind us that the notion of justice is always going dead in us, and that you have to fight to keep it alive, you know, that there are forces constantly at work that drain our consciousness, you know, our consciousness and our concerns and compassions for others. And it's a hard fight in these societies. I mean, you're isolated. It's these societies that are radically atomized and individualized, difficult to develop social collectives. I mean, I work in a university where people are enormously friendly and terribly antisocial. You know, I mean, the kinds of deep roots of community and solidarity that I had as a kid have never been repeated for me in that working class neighborhood.
Yeah, but in any university?
Oh, universities.
No, not universities.
Universities are like hotels. People come and go, you know. That's what they're like, you know.
And how do you, I'm sorry, I shouldn't.
Sure.
But how do you negotiate that? And how do you recharge? What do you,
I tell myself that I'll never give my heart to an institution. I don't believe that. I will do whatever I can to make sure that in some fundamental way I don't betray the contract that I've negotiated with this university to do. I publish, I teach, I write, and I do my best. But my heart is not here. You know, my heart is really with my students. My heart is really with the people I love, my wife. You know, I mean, I try in some way to, in the absence of larger communities in my life, I try to find those spaces where I can always have people constantly remind me that there's more to life than academia. Right? I mean, I think that I think that I'm absolutely unwilling to let that go in my life. I'm not going to let that go. I am not going to be a technocrat who wears a radical tie or a radical hat or a radical badge. I'm not going to do that. It doesn't interest me. You know, it's for me. It's always about the connection to something else. Always about that connection, and that sort of keeps me alive. I mean, it keeps me going here. You know, the work keeps me going because it's not just work for the university, and that's what I mean when I say I'm not giving them my heart. I'm not just working for them. Sorry, you know, this work has larger public implications. I mean, it hopefully, and who knows? I don't know who reads it. I get some impression that people read it, but I feel good about doing it. I think that it matters. And I think that in some way, hopefully it provides a model for students that I work with. You know, I must tell you, I mean, the group that you have interviewed, which I feel very humbled to be a part of, and certainly do not rank myself as worthy of that group. So with that qualification, let me say this. Look, I think that one of the things I have noticed as I grow older is that there are a whole generation of intellectuals who are dying. I mean, whether we talk about people like Marcuse or these endless people who are now dying, right? Norman Mailer, they're never going to be repeated again. You're not going to see this anymore. The Zygmunt Baumans of the world, you know, God forbid. The Howard Zinns of the world. There's an endless number of intellectuals that have, I have been very lucky in my life. Blessed by being born at a time when I can read intellectuals who were not merely shaped by the academy, whose breadth of knowledge transcended disciplines, whose sense of engagement was so profound that you never thought of them as celebrity stars waiting to appear on national television and talk for 5 seconds, you know. But that generation is going. This is one of the things that marks this change that we've talked about, you know, these new elements in this kind of, heady, globalizing world we find ourselves in. People aren't being educated like this anymore. The technology has changed. Information is from everywhere. It's more flat, you know, rather than vertical, right? Information has become flat. And hence we don't have the depth of analysis, the Stanley Aronowitzes, the Alan Willises of the world. Oh, my God. These people are like incredible to read, you know, when you see what they've done and, you know, the way in which their own projects have marked their intervention into worlds that aren't neatly defined by the academy. You understand what I'm saying? And I'm not just talking about the world of the public intellectuals, right? I'm talking about a whole generation of intellectuals who finally now, whose lives are coming to an end. But an era is coming to an end. And I think that for those people you have taped outside of me, this is important. It's important to record these. These memories matter because they offer a visual litany to a world that is going to be hard to see in the future. It won't be televised. As Abby Hoffman said, the revolution will not be televised. They will not be televised. Ideas are central, you know. They're not just political, they're central. I think that what we've lost in this day and age is the central quality of ideas. We've lost what it means to exchange. Iran just got it right, you know. She said without debate and dialogue, without thoughtfulness, there's no politics. And what totalitarianism is it's a politics without people. People become disposable. There's your Katrina answer. People become disposable. You want to give a simple definition for fascism? It's a society in which people become utterly disposable and disappear. They disappear from visibility, and they literally disappear in police vans. And I think that when people often ask me, what's the purpose of schooling? You know, I lived in a country for most of my life in which people now disappear, taken off and sent to states to be tortured, you know, by ruthless authoritarian governments. I lived in a country where people are debating whether waterboarding is justifiable. Can you imagine? I live in a country where children's health insurance policies, you know, a health program, federal health program, which millions of kids who have no money, are utterly poor, have no health care, has been vetoed now twice by a president who claims he doesn't want to pass it because it suggests something about socialism. Oh my God! I mean, and we want to ask: does education matter? Is there a relevance for education? I mean, how should we theorize it? You know, well, maybe the old neoliberal notion of live or die, you know, actually becomes true, increasingly true around the question of education itself. We eliminate education, an education that matters, and we really have the death of public life. And with the death of public life, we have the rise of fascism, and we have the emergence of totalitarianism in ways we have never seen possible before. You know, we're not talking about, you know, goose-stepping soldiers marching into town, you know, right? We're talking about, believe me, something much more subtle, much more friendly, and much more devastating. Oh, sure he does. I mean, he talks about gardening. I mean, Bauman talks about gardening. You know, people miss Bauman. They miss this point. He says, it's not about the new technologies. It's not about technocratic or instrumental rationality. It's about combining it with a notion of progress linked to questions of purity. The gardener, not the person who plants weeds, the gardener, right? They want everything clean. Like this attack on immigration is about gardening, right? About racial purity. I mean, then you have to ask yourself, what are the larger articulations that we can cling to offset these arguments? Where is the discourse about democracy? Well, where is the discourse about social justice? I mean, where are kids learning a language that says the social matters? That says that provisions matter for the elderly, for the weak, for the poor, that healthcare should never be should be an entitlement. You know, I mean, it should be a right? That should be a right, not a private act of charity. I mean, my concern with these kids is that a language that marked the 60s now is often seen as precisely that. Something about as important and as significant as the hula hoop, right? Or, you know, the emergence of the Beatles. But there's no sense in which that residual discourse now probably is more important as an emergent discourse and a necessary discourse than it was then. That's why people often say, well, Giroux, you know, I mean, he's not talking about Deleuze, he's not talking about postmodernism, and it's kind of hard to read. There seems to be a certain nostalgia. Well, I'm sorry, it's not about nostalgia, it's about urgency. I'm less concerned about education being linked to the question of the contemplative notion of critique than I am to the notion of the critical that all of a sudden gets informed by the possibility of action. That's a very different emergence into education. So that in the raw has been read, paragraphs have been outlined, we have now duplicated the article, then cut it into this, and we then have that, then we duplicate that so you can work with it. And then we write on that new piece, and then we produce a cover page, which will list now the narrowed down organizing ideas of that piece. So the piece is really basically being read 3 times. Being read at least 3 times. I came to it because I found I had a short memory. And I found that it was much better. I couldn't find, by putting tabs in things and little cards, it was unmanageable to me. And what I discovered was I really needed a way to have this stuff in front of me, distill it in ways in which I could get the essence of ideas, and then juxtapose those ideas in ways in which I could establish relationships that I couldn't see otherwise. So I needed the question of sight, the question of the panoramic sight, being able to see it and then imagine it in different ways. So it wasn't just a question of reading, it was also a question of watching, viewing. So my eyes became as important as the understanding. You see what I'm talking about? I mean, it's equally as important to be able to see these things together. I mean, Maya has come in when I have things taped up, and I'm trying to put a piece together in which I'm drawing from these different sources. And I mean, for me, it's just exciting. It's like writing a play, and different parts are coming together from different sources, you know. And then you finally see it, and you think, wow, God. I mean, things that have been written that if I didn't use this method, I could never have done, never. The Adorno piece is a classic example, the Abu Ghraib, where you go back, you have all this literature already you've read on Frankfurt School, you pick up some pieces, you review it, and then all of a sudden you make the application. But here's another issue. Look, say I find myself, say you come to me and you say, look, Henry, I have to read something on Adorno, right? Let me just see this. Or I need to read, what are you reading, what have you read on Aronowitz in this book on class? This very famous book, probably the best book he's ever written, How Class Works. And I say, well, if you're in a hurry, take the notes and take a look at it. So I can share this with you in ways that would give Robert or you an hour. You could do this, and you could have a working knowledge for something that you ordinarily can't spend. I mean, look, we have to be discriminate. Sometimes we just can't read everything in its entirety. We can't do it. There's too much information. So in many ways, what this does is it also provides a way for me to go back and not have to read. I mean, I can't read the stuff on the Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer again, the culture industry again, right? But I can read it here, and I can read it in 20 minutes. And that's unreal for me. That works. I mean, that really works. We all have this thing about Bauman, right? How's this? Let's see if we can get this. This is right. Now what? Now here's what Maya. Here's what Maya and I do. Now, this will just give you one example of how the different formats in which we're using this. Okay. Now I'm going to go to Bauman notes. Okay. Now these are some of the notes. We know some. Okay. All right. Now let's say that we want to look at the cover page for Liquid Times. These are all the cover. This is the cover page for Liquid Times. It goes on and on, right? I mean, this is it. This is actually only the introduction. But what we do is by typing this stuff out. Now I go in and whatever I want to use something, I just take the quote right out, so it's done. I mean, the speed that it affords you is actually mind blowing. And I'll just to give you another. Look at this. Look at all this stuff on Bauman. I mean, he probably occupies more than almost any other. I mean, people on Bauman on modernity. These are the notes on the Holocaust and modernity that we had talked about, right? Now, if I'm on the phone with you and you call me and you say, I'm thinking about Bauman and modernity, let's talk. I say, okay, hold on, Robert, just for a minute.
Okay, yes. That's absolutely marvelous.
I get interviews. People call me, right? I have my little computer here.
Yeah.
And they'll say, well, what about this? I hit it. And they're like, wow, that was articulate.
Yes.
when in fact, right, Catherine, right? I mean, when in fact, I mean, all this, I mean, the question is to get information accessible. You need to have access to it.
Absolutely.
That's the key, right? Because there are tons of it. And it's,
Wow.
it just, for me, it's just, and Maya will tell you, I mean, the method is mind-blowing. I mean, it's just, isn't it? What we are able to do with it? Because she goes through, Maya takes it from the reading. I do the reading, she cuts it, right? Duplicates it, she reads it, right? I then, we do the cover pages, we go back and forth. I then do the article. She's following me all the way through.
Oh my word.
She's following me with the quotes. She's following me with the line of argument. And so, I mean, isn't it interesting, right? I have an endowed chair, and the person who is the most important to me, besides my wife, of course, Susan, in dealing with this information is my administrative assistant, who is as smart as anybody I've ever met. And we constantly work this stuff together. And it's just a pleasure. That's a very important picture right there. That I love. Well, that picture is very, very old. I got it when I was in high school. And basically it just constantly reminds me of the importance of education as a political act.